Hi all, this is Tom Broussard. It is still stroke month, but today I'm going to talk about some interesting stories from some friends of mine about optimism. I have a bunch of friends and we've been emailing each other, obviously with the stroke, everybody with the, virus, talking about strokes, about the virus. And somebody in the various conversations talked about when they say optimism is a force multiplier. And I like that a lot. I guess I've heard that before. My friend, obviously texting from Germany, and that was a lot of friends' interest. So I told him that I thought that was a good idea, and I would talk about that here today. Because optimism has an awful lot to do with how I got better and how all my friends have gotten better over the years. And it's not like everybody goes from here to somehow perfect. It's really, we get better every day, little by little by little. And to the degree that if it's been years going by, it's not to say that you've gotten perfectly over those many years, but over those years, you've gotten better every single day if you continue to do what we all have to do, which is practice our language. So it was good to hear from Mike's notation. And I do remember after now all these years of meeting with thousands of people with aphasia and hundreds of speech language pathologists, people, speech therapists, began to then take note of how the presentations went from my perspective and from their perspective. And everything that I saw happening for me in terms of me learning from being with these various groups around the country is that we all shared our story. I mean, obviously I was there to share my story, but as part of the process, everybody there in the room shared their own story one way or another. And that was a lot of fun because everybody was happy. That's not to say that you're not still faced with the issue of having lost your language and getting it back. But many people, everybody in that room, had to have been optimistic because they were in that room and they wanted to meet others like me and others in their room to continue to refer, to talk about themselves as what they had lost and what they are now getting better. And I realized that at the time that now when I make my presentations, and I have been doing it for years, I'm not really there to talk about my story as much as share all of our stories together. And yes, I'm there to share a little bit more, but that is part of the issue is of getting better is sharing, because in the sharing, then you're talking about it as best you can, emotional about it as best you can, and let other people see how each of us are making the journey. And you can tell from the boats next to you who's ahead, who's behind going forward. And that seems to be another interesting process of us going forward. Because for all the therapy we've had over the years, we continue to get better in somewhat of an accidental way, highly accidental way. Because for the most part, if not every time, nobody tells us to do these things and tomorrow you'll get better. I mean, some people do think that, do these things and tomorrow you get better. But that's not the way it works. It's not the way the brain works. The brain takes its time. It has to bring in the information. So that means it has to actually be exposed to, has to experience certain information, even as reading, writing, speaking, sharing. And the brain absorbs that information and over time gets to build the neuromatter, the additional components that allow the brain to regain their language. And that takes time. There is no instantaneous cause and effect. There is an optimistic understanding that all of these causes will result in eventual effects the more you do it and the more you do it over time. But with the people with aphasia and their speech therapists, it turns out, I would say, this is just me, that our relationship with them are highly symbiotic. I'll get to pronouncing that soon, even though it's right here in front of me. Symbiotic, in that no matter what we are doing, the therapist knows that we're not going to get better based on what they're telling us to do. They know that. They are helping us create an environment that allows us to be confident, to be motivated, to be optimistic about doing what we used to do before the stroke. We had to get better. We had to go to school. We had to learn new things, new jobs. All of that really means that you're inducing the same capacity to learn as you do with stroke and aphasia. Before the stroke, you have to do those things, but you're not necessarily aware. After your stroke, yes, you're much more aware that you will get better if you do these things going forward. And the teacher, the speech therapist, they don't tell us. It's like our teachers back then that we really didn't like, because they told us to do these things. And we said, yeah, I don't want to do that because I just don't like it. Now we like what we do. It turns out that everything has to do with our interest. Even back then, even the teachers would tell us to do things. We don't want to do that. We will do these other things because we really like that. Same thing works with us. And over the years, after we have our stroke, we begin to realize that with our therapist, that it isn't that they tell us to do these things, they are just creating this environment. So that's why we become so accidental that we get better. We also are part of this symbiotic relationship we have with our therapist, because we have to do what we have to do, not because they must, but because we must. And we have to be part of this optimistic approach. So everybody I've ever seen in all of these rooms, and there have been thousands of them, they are there for one good reason, because they are motivated to understand who they are and how they can get better. And they become, obviously they were optimistic even before they got to that room. But now, for all of us thousands who have been in those rooms, there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands who are not in that room. So all of us who are optimistic, are motivated, are now in a position to become more, as I call them, stroke educators than stroke survivors. Because then as stroke educators, we can then continue basically with this march that all of our SLPs have done to get us this far. Then we have to pick up the mantle, as it were, to go forward with all the other millions of people, literally in the country, who don't know anything about aphasia. I'll say tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in the United States don't know anything about aphasia. And as a result, they don't understand how the brain really does work. Because whether you're healthy or not, you will get better, you will learn using the exact same tools that a person with stroke and aphasia actually comes to understand, believe it or not, that the brain does repair itself, even if it's damaged. And again, not a lot of people understand that there is quite this accidental, invisible capacity, but it is not at all unlike photosynthesis, which converts light into green leaves. And with people with stroke and aphasia, it converts thought and cognitive activities into neuromatter, into dendrites, what I call the branches of a tree, and synapses, what I call the leaves of that tree and those branches. And we convert those activities, believe it or not, the neural activity into neuromatter. And that becomes the improvement that we all want to know more about, how we can all learn and how we can learn as a result of stroke and aphasia as well. So optimism is real. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's more reality than real. but people with stroke and aphasia are more than real about the fact that we see our deficits, we're aware of our deficits, and you have to become aware because it does take this process. You can have stroke and aphasia and still not yet know that you're aware of those deficits. So that's sort of the next step of learning. And once you become aware, then you are more mentally informed of what you're seeing and not seeing on the inside, and begin to activate those different activities, whether they be reading, writing, and speaking, or other iterations of any of those modalities. That is how the brain actually works going forward, as we all become much more of a stroke educator than a stroke survivor. But I'm glad that my friend, his name is OJ, I'm so glad that he mentioned that one little thing. And a lot of my learning comes as a result of hearing these little tiny things. And it goes way back in time, and you begin to understand, oh, I remember hearing that before in terms of the Optimists being a force multiplier. And that helps a lot in terms of how you remember what you remembered before. And now, I've said this before, after your stroke and aphasia, you still have the same intellect, and you still have that capacity to remember what you remembered before, begin to draw it up to your present day, and begin to thread together the cloth, the thread that you had built before, now damaged. You get to rethread it again. And that really is the way it works. You create new threads, thread them together, and what you had lost, you begin to see it again. And there's nothing magic about it. It just happens to look like magic because it all happens somewhat automatically. I know, it's pretty amazing. Anyway, nice to see you guys. I will see you again in a couple more days, but take care of yourself and have a good week. All right, take care of yourself. Bye-bye.